to hear Angelica's new song, Guilt Trip. It was really awesome. I know Robin and I were hitting it off just hearing that song, so that's really great. In addition to that, Sherry, did you get a chance to take a headshot at the LinkedIn photo booth?
You know what? I actually haven't yet, but it is on my list of one of the things I wanted to do today at the conference because it is important to have a headshot for LinkedIn and mine needs an update. But did you know, Delvine, that a good profile picture for LinkedIn is equal to 3 times more profile views? So it sounds like it's super important to have that when you're trying to find a job.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Okay, I'm gonna definitely make sure that I take full advantage and take my LinkedIn headshot today before the end
Mhm.
of the day, maybe the next break. Let's see.
Of
Um,
course.
all right, well, now I'm excited to be back and to hear from our next speaker, who Sherry will introduce.
Yes, of course. So we have Joel Demby. He is a Sheridan Marketing Management graduate who is also an advocate for accessibility and inclusion. He's a 5-time Canadian national wheelchair tennis champion, and he's won 30 international singles and doubles titles and completed at the Paralympics. So, in this conversation, he'll be sharing his story and how he continues to speak out against the stigma associated with visible and invisible disabilities. The chat will be moderated by Deandra Christopher, Accessible Learning Advisor for Student Affairs here at Sheridan. So, welcome, Joel and Deandra.
Good afternoon. Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, everyone. How are you? As mentioned, my name is Deandra Christopher, and thank you for having me today. I do apologize. I might sound a little bit more raspy than usual. I am getting over a bit of cold. I'm reacclimatizing back into our lovely Canadian weather. But hopefully you'll bear with me if you see me taking a sip or drinking some water. But I do have the pleasure today of doing a lovely conversation with Joel today and having him deep dive and discuss his experience and chat with us today. So I thought it makes sense if we jump into our first question and get to know Joel a little bit better. So that being said, Joel, if you could take a few minutes and to introduce yourself and briefly share an overview of your story with us, including your journey to the Paralympics and a little bit about yourself.
Sure, and I brought a few photos with me, and great to have everyone virtually today, and hopefully one day we can resume these in person. But I want to share a little bit about my story because it's usually the first thing someone asks me is, what happened, which is a weird thing for someone to say the first time they meet you. But in my case, I use a wheelchair. I was born with a disability. I had a spinal tumor that was successfully removed, but it led to me sort of having a partial paralysis. So for most of my childhood, I was in a wheelchair. Still use a wheelchair. You can't see it today, but it's a big part of my life. And for me, you can see here that I didn't exactly let my wheelchair get in the way of enjoying life. And you can see I can stand up in certain circumstances here. And most of the time it was for the photographer. It was meant to show some style, and in sport, I really found a calling. And my mom and dad were really instrumental in introducing me to a number of activities. Whenever I meet someone with a disability, especially someone who's young and wants to learn skills, the first thing I tell them is to get involved in sport. And so quite literally, sport played such a huge part of my life right from the get-go. I learned a lot about myself. I learned that I was not only capable of doing things on my own, but in reality, I was an athlete, and I wanted to be more known as an athlete than some kid in a wheelchair, which in reality, I was both, because where I went to school, and I'm from the Hamilton area originally, I was the only child in my entire school that had a physical disability. And so at times, it was a bit lonely being someone different. But, as I got more introduced to wheelchair sports and other para sports, I realized I wasn't alone. And in fact, I started to truly believe that being different was actually a strength. And I think that's one thing that I want to just first mention. I'm going to quickly move on to slide because the big thing for me was wheelchair tennis. And with wheelchair tennis, it was really cool because in wheelchair tennis, you can actually play with able-bodied athletes as well. So for any of the students on the call that play tennis, very similar wheelchair tennis, we just get a second bounce. So I was able to sort of play the sport with able-bodied athletes. And that became a real catalyst for me in life, in that no matter your ability, the fact that you're not separated from everyone else when you want to pursue something became really important to me. So I was able to play wheelchair tennis alongside family and friends, and nothing gave me more pleasure than beating someone with two legs. So that became something that I really drove toward. I just want to split the differences because most people think that I play wheelchair tennis in my everyday wheelchair. That's not true. That chair on the left you see on the screen, the one without the slanted wheels, that's the everyday chair, the chair that I would have come to Sheridan with, the chair that I go to office in, which we're slowly moving into a hybrid model very shortly. The chair on the right is sport equipment. It allows me to turn faster, pivot, encourage you to go to YouTube after the session's done, of course, to sort of get a sense of how wheelchair tennis is played. But it's a huge sport. It took me all around the world. I went to every continent and back, and it led to so many great opportunities, including representing Canada at the Paralympics. I often get this question, Deandra, what does the Paralympics mean? And we're actually about to, actually been in the news today, quite honestly, the Paralympics, with the recent decision to remove Russia from the Paralympics. But Paralympics doesn't mean paralyzed Olympics. It means it runs parallel to the Olympics. We as athletes, para-athletes, want to be known on the same level as our Olympic counterparts. And so very soon today, you'll see the opening ceremonies at the Beijing Winter Paralympics. I competed in London 2012, and I was able to end my career at the Toronto 2015 Pan Am Games, winning a medal against our rivals, the United States. But no, we're good friends, I promise. I had a ball, quite literally playing sport, traveling, competing. There's much more to the story, obviously, and we'll get into that, Deandra. But again, I was able to cap my career off in the best way, winning a medal for Canada. And like I said, when you're an athlete, it leads to so many incredible opportunities. So a bit about my wheelchair background, and we'll go to more stuff later on, but just wanted to give you a sense of who I am, the sports I played, and really my background.
That was quite an incredible story. And it's so awesome that, you were able to end your career on such a high note. So that's amazing. You kind of spoke about some interesting things around strength and resilience and, that piece around your learning journey and the role that sports played. So on to my second question. If you can speak about growing up with a physical disability and continually adapting to different challenges. So you obviously sports facilitated that, but if you could just speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the one term that I always touch on is empowerment. I think all of us, even today, and I'm no different, struggle with confidence. And, it's very prototypical for someone to say sport gives you confidence. Well, in my case, that's exactly what it did. And growing up, feeling a little bit isolated in terms of being able to do the same things that my brother or friends in my neighborhood, classmates were able to do. I didn't want them to look at me as the person that's being left behind. I wanted them to think, wow, Joel is driven. He's into something that is a true passion. And I wanted to be known as an athlete. I didn't want to be known as someone who looked like he was ill or sick. Someone that, I wanted to be, someone that people felt compelled to not only look up to, but see as someone who isn't his disability, more than that. So that was super important to me, Deandra.
And definitely on the moment and your point about empowerment, I think that really leads into our next question, which kind of talks about, using sports and facilitating that in your empowerment and your growth from that around, really you being seen as like an advocacy or championship for accessibility and inclusion. So my next question is, were there any pivotal or unexpected moments in your journey that kind of set you apart, that started that journey around advocacy and championing for accessibility and inclusion?
Yeah, and I think like many athletes, you might have been in a school where someone visited you who was an Olympian or Paralympian, but we're often seen as advocates for whatever we're involved in. That is so important. Being an advocate when you're an athlete, you're something beyond your sport in many ways. And some athletes over the last few years, we've seen use that platform to drive meaningful change. I can think of, in the tennis world, some incredible examples, whether it's Billie Jean King, Serena Williams, really advocating for things that go way beyond hitting a ball over a net, quite frankly. And in my case, I felt like advocating for people with disabilities was the right thing. For me, I always like to focus on adolescents, children, because in my formative years, I did struggle. I struggled with the fact that the world wasn't necessarily designed for me. And I think when you start traveling the world in a wheelchair, no less, you start to realize, okay, wow, there are places that I've been where people with disabilities are left behind, second-class citizens, and that's not right. And why that happens is accessibility. And so if the bus or transit system in a city in Belgium or anywhere isn't accessible, you're going to leave a segment of the population behind. And so disability by nature is a very human-centric issue. It can happen to all of us, anyone on this call, not to frighten anyone, but most of the athletes that I competed with, unlike myself, were able-bodied at one point, but through sheer nature or circumstance, ended up in a wheelchair. And so we have to be a little bit more proactive in supporting people with disabilities, because we do have an aging population in Canada. We know that the more accessible we make our country, the better it is for everyone. Case in point, if you're a mom or dad with a stroller and the door can open up automatically, it makes your life easier. Mm-hmm. Flip side is, even getting grocery delivery. It works for everyone, but it definitely works for people with disabilities too.
Absolutely, absolutely. And speaking of that, and talking about disabilities and, physical disabilities, you talk about kind of your experience around that. So I was just going to say, if you could, in a minute, what does disability mean to you, including the full spectrum? So you'd mentioned invisible and visible disabilities as well.
Yeah, I would say, by sheer nature, we've evolved. In, just to give some background here, we've evolved our language as it relates to disability. So mm-hmm. I actually don't think of the word anymore, because I hear it all the time, whether it's finding a disabled parking spot or it literally has stopped providing any meaning to me, because the word can mean so many different things now. But what I think of about disability is I think of 1 in 5 in Canada having a disability. That's a huge, huge, huge number. So I think of humans. I think in many cases we're learning that we're not so different from one another. So by sheer nature, I might not relate to someone who has a visual disability, someone who uses perhaps a hearing aid, but we do relate to the fact that we use tools or technology to allow us to do our daily lives. I'm no different. I use the wheelchair. Otherwise, that's it. So disability has evolved from older terms. We used to use handicap in the 80s. We no longer use those terms. Disability is the modern way, but you have to be careful, because you can't just say disabled persons. And why we say that is you put the person always before the disability. So in my mind, when I'm talking to my doubles partner who also uses a wheelchair, I'm not thinking about, oh yeah, my wheelchair friend Philippe. No, I'm thinking about all of us. And so disability can mean many things, but to me, it just means all of us.
Mm-hmm. That's a great response. And we're getting some great questions. I'm definitely going to bridge them in. So please note that they're not forgotten, but I do see some great questions coming in. So I'm going to kind of thread them through as our questions, as I guide. So these are keep the questions coming in. And so one of the, we're going to build on some ideas around how to support someone that is newly disabled, or support someone around to have a more open perspective around accessibility in everyday lives. But before that, I just wanted to connect with Joel and find out some of the tactics to remove biases or stigmas around ideas associated with disabilities. So if you can kind of build on that.
Yeah, I would say, and I have different things to say about this, but how we remove biases and stigma is to educate ourselves. So the best way to support people with disabilities is get to know us, learn, be very curious. Do not be afraid to ask questions. I would say get to know the person before you go, hey, how'd you get in a wheelchair? You would introduce yourself. Lead with empathy. I think that, get to know the person. I keep going back to that, and I've said it multiple times, but say hi, be an ally for change. But also, as it relates to accessibility, try to see things from our standpoint. So, for example, if you do meet someone in a wheelchair, think about how we communicate with that person in a wheelchair. Would it be better to maybe sit alongside them when you want to get to know them, or stand up and look down? I think it's always best to try to meet us at eye level. And by us, I'm being very broad here. Disability is so many things, so and it's changing every day. But educate yourself on accessibility, including digital tools and technology, captioning, ASL. We're learning a lot during the pandemic about some of the gaps in accessibility, specifically the digital ones. We're getting better in many of our communities, Oakville, Hamilton, Toronto, on building accessibility. Having been to Sheridan, I can tell you, I had a lot of fun with those ramps. I got to say, there's like some awesome ramps at the Trafalgar campus. I definitely ran over a few people from time to time, but hey, that's some collateral damage there. But it was very accessible. I had parking, but all those things, you have to understand that accessibility is how you remove bias and stigma. If there were no gaps in accessibility, we wouldn't be talking about this.
Absolutely. And you make some really great points, and I like those. So, as students who are attending campuses, that vision of like seeing if there is any challenge around accessibility. So like if a door is not working, that awareness, right? Like I think what Joel's saying is like having that perspective. And I also like your point around like meeting someone at eye level and always seeing the person first before disability. I think those are really key points and really great starting points, just little things to start in your role and interactions with individuals who may or may not have a disability. So those are great points. And then, speaking on that, your personal experience, what are some of the barriers, either invisible or visible, that you face as a student or employee along your journey?
Yeah, I often get asked this, and I should say I'm with RBC. I'm not speaking on behalf of RBC, but I can share some of the things that we look at and I look at as part of RBC Reach, which is our employee resource group for employees with disabilities at RBC. One of the things we forget is just getting to work for many people isn't the same. And I've had many experiences taking Go Transit, the TTC over the years, where I had a meeting and I was late for the meeting, not because of anything that I did, but because the elevator was broken. So what I think we've learned and are learning right now is through more flexibility, we can often accommodate for most forms of disabilities. If you're very rigid as an instructor or institution or employer, you're going to leave a very large segment of the population behind. And so I think we're going to have to continue to look at how we recruit people with disabilities. We need to understand that the same questions you ask of someone who maybe has an invisible disability might need to be changed. And so all we are asking, and again, I don't represent everyone, but in this context, I want to say we are asking for equality and to be judged not by our disability, but by our abilities and skills. And I think sometimes, not to speak of any, organization or institution here, we look at disabilities as the square pegs in the round holes. Not everything you mandate in terms of diversity and inclusion will actually work with disability. Oftentimes it's actually, oh yeah, that's right, we don't have the technology right now or the understanding of the technology to do this. And what I see happen time and time again, and this is even, pre my corporate life, is that we don't train hiring managers on workplace accommodation. We don't hire recruiters on ways to engage with student organizations and accessibility, coordinators in places like Sheridan. I think we need to continue to upgrade our skills. So I think employers still haven't figured out disability. We are only just learning over the last couple of years that, wait a minute, we didn't even have a national accessibility law. And so unlike United States, and I can say a lot about discrimination in other countries, but when it comes to disability inclusion, United States isn't one of them. They've had something called the Americans with Disabilities Act since 1990. We just passed our first national law on they call the Accessible Canada Act in 2018. Unacceptable. We have provincial laws, we have the Canadian Charter of Human Rights, but we don't have those mandates yet, or the teeth to penalize organizations or people to improve their accessible practices. So that's one reason that I sink my teeth into this stuff. I'm very much involved, both within RBC and outside, as you know. So it's important stuff. But by just listening to what I have to say today, I hope you are learning and can also be advocates for change.
And we got a good question, and I think that could kind of tie in like a part B, that we talk about individuals that could do to be more accessible and have more considerations around inclusive practices, but what can leadership do? So we have a question around what can leadership and leaders do to employ more inclusive strategies or practices, I guess, in their daily work with whether it's employees or students or things along those lines.
From a corporate level, put disability on the board agenda. Put it on the board agenda and separate it, ironically, from diversity inclusion, because there is this, this is a global thing, not just here in Canada, and it's been touched at the World Economic Forum, which is huge for Fortune 500 companies. But there has been a trend to move companies in the direction of saying, we want to put accessibility on the board agenda. Now, why is that important? Because I believe the more accessible your company or institution, education is, the more talent you'll attract, and the better you're going to address gaps that your clients, your consumers face. Because in reality, if all of us, and Canada included, have this aging population, by nature of age, you are going to acquire a disability. So if I can't use your product or service because of my disability, guess what? I'm not going to spend money. It's like a small business, and don't get me wrong, small businesses have greatly suffered throughout the pandemic, but I mean, I don't go into a restaurant that's not accessible.
Of course.
So at its foundational core, now we're lucky at RBC from a physical standpoint. Our branches are very good in terms of accessibility, and TD, CIBC, we're very good. But not every corporation, not every school has that accessibility. I actually went to Brock University prior to attending Sheridan, and I went to Brock because the campus was accessible. It was more modern, similar with the Trafalgar campus at Sheridan. So we definitely have to put that on the leadership agenda, both in post-secondary education, but also in the corporate sector as well.
Those are some great points. Thank you. So let me just see if we. I think you kind of touched on it. I was looking at the question around inclusive barrier-free society that accepts diverse identities, but I think you've kind of highlighted some key points in your last points, which were really great. So, building on that then, as the voice for lack of representation among people with disability, what do you think are the first steps for creating change? And again, I guess change around, more representation around those areas as well.
Yeah, and I struggle with this because I think a lot of organizations, we are trying to find talent, talent with disabilities, and we struggle to find it. And I have started to come to the realization that I actually believe most organizations already have a lot of employees with disabilities, but we're too afraid. And now I can't get away from right over virtual. You can't see my disability, and in a way, it's liberating. It's refreshing for a change because again, I'm a screen, just like everyone else here, a window. But I think disclosure is the gap right now. I think many employees who have invisible disabilities, we're talking perhaps even mental health, pre-existing conditions, could be something like rheumatoid arthritis, that we are afraid to tell our employer that we have a disability because we feel that will have a negative impact on our career. Now, who can blame someone for choosing that? Because let's be honest, how many people or leaders do we know that have a disability and are very public about it? Now, in the Paralympic side, I can think of a million mentors with disabilities in the Paralympics, but that's our identity. But in the corporate world, we don't see that. And I think if you don't see an example of someone in a leadership role with a disability who's talking about it and mentioning those struggles, you are not going to see junior employees, people who are new, who are onboarding into the organization, or even those who are in middle management roles like myself, disclose that disability. We want to see examples of it. And I haven't seen that. I see a few sporadically around, but not enough. And we're seeing and I don't want to, give any specifics here, but we're seeing examples of that on the LGBTQ side of things. We're seeing, Tim Cook being actually a really great example at Apple, disclosing that he was part of that community. I want to see that. I want to see a CEO of a major Fortune 500 company disclosing a disability, because that's where we're going to see change. And so I believe that we need to see examples of it. In the absence of it, I'm like many people that are going to be very public about it and making it a point to say, here's exactly where my challenges are. Here's the economic opportunity in absence of us not addressing disability inclusion. And I'm going to keep pressing. And like many other people who are advocates with disabilities, we don't mind getting our hands dirty and continuing to advocate for change. And we're still not even close.
And then for, thinking about that, it's just a sidebar question around addressing and speaking up around disclosure. Do you have any, because whether obviously in Sheridan, we have a lot of students, or whether employees, just how to address the idea of disclosure, because it is often an area of challenge in my role working with students, that students really struggle with, when is the right time, whether to disclose for co-op or placement, or even around using accommodations within, their classroom setting. So if you could speak to, speaking to disclosure and that piece around that.
Yeah, it's a great question. You and I talked about this a few days ago. I believe where we are now, and this is what I wholly believe, I believe it is to your benefit to disclose. The reason why I say that, in the absence of everything in every company or every place you go, in the absence of true accessibility, fully accessible, which we're not, and it's always going to be a moving line, get the supports you need to do your job. And most organizations, most post-secondary institutions, Sheridan included, you do not actually need to disclose to your boss, to your manager, to your instructor that you have a disability. You can go to, the accessibility department at Sheridan. You can literally email Deandra and ask Hey, curious, what supports do you offer? Because I'm struggling here. You can do the same thing in most organizations. You can go to the workplace accommodation team at RBC, for example, and get the support you need. And you don't have to do it during the onboarding process. You might come to the realization over time that, hey, I am struggling with my setup here. What supports can I get? And actually, most organizations have a budget for that. We do have actually some brilliant people working in workplace accommodations. Where I think you need to, where I would say it's a personal choice is disclosing to your manager. I would say always, I would hope that your manager will lead with empathy. It's something that I believe we've improved across Canada, across the United States, in really understanding mental health, for example, understanding what people have had to overcome over the last 2 years of this pandemic. So I believe we are better positioned as a nation to address the needs of employers. The last thing, and most people forget about this, maximize your benefits. If you are hired full-time at an organization, make sure you look at your group benefits. Maybe it'll be with Sun Life or whomever, but take advantage of those, because you have access to certain supports that you might not have had you actually ironically not been employed. And I think that's something that I can address, because, for example, wheelchair repairs, things like that, not all of that is actually covered by the Ontario government. It would be done by your insurer. In some cases. I don't want to speak for all insurance plans, but make sure you do that too, because that can be a form of accommodation you can get outside of the office.
That's a great point. That's an excellent point around reviewing benefits. Awesome. So those are some really great points. And the next question, so we've got about 2 more questions. There's no other questions. I'm going to keep going with our questions, and we're doing okay for time, just checking. So change for good comes down to leadership. So today's conference is all about igniting our leadership and realizing that we all have the ability to be a leader. Leadership doesn't require you to be in an informal title, role, position, but to have an impact on yourself, the teams you work with, and in your community. You are a prime example of this as an advocate and a champion of accessibility, inclusion, and fighting for the fundamental rights of people with disabilities. What are some steps that we can take to be good ally and help make change? So you've touched on some of those key pieces, but if you could talk about it around just simple, actionable steps that even as many of the students are here today, that simple things that they can walk away and do today, tomorrow, that'd be great as well.
Yeah, I was really lucky. My dad, he's passed away, but he was very involved as a volunteer. Community engagement, I feel, is something that we've lost a little bit of over the years. I can recall, being involved in many volunteer opportunities. For me, I volunteer as a tennis coach still. I try to train the next generation of wheelchair athletes. Not lately, because obviously with restrictions, it's been difficult. But I'd encourage you to get involved. There's many organizations in and around the Greater Toronto region, including Easter Seals. I would challenge you that actually employers do look at, like RBC, they do look at what you've done away from the office. And actually, even if you're a leader, we often see leaders on the boards of nonprofits that you have a close connection to. I would say we're always looking for volunteers to get involved in parasports as well. In reality, most of the tennis tournaments that I would compete in around the world were often run by volunteers. So definitely get involved. I know there's some great groups at Sheridan, not just in the disability space, of course, but we're talking in all forms of things that we need help with. The other thing I would say is don't be afraid to offer help to someone who needs it. There is a right and a wrong way to offer help, by the way. The wrong way would be if you see me going up a hill and you come up behind me and start pushing, that takes away some of my independence. So when you do see someone struggling, and by the way, we get that a lot in Canada because sidewalks sometimes aren't plowed. I think it's always good to ask, hey, I'm Deandra. Hey, I'm Joel. I saw that you, it looked like you're struggling there. Could I offer you some help? Put that on the shoulders of someone with the disability. Oftentimes, someone like me will be very hard-headed and go, no, I can do it. And usually I can. I'm just a little slower on occasion. I'm going downhill. I'm quite fast and can be quite dangerous. So watch out. But in general, ask before you help, because you don't know if someone can actually do something. So those are just some easy, quick tips that I think are quite easy.
That's those are some really great key small ones. And I like the idea of doing some work outside and taking initiative and taking part. And especially for many students who potentially are going to be seeking jobs in the future, that's a great idea about like getting in that volunteer work and doing some of those pieces. So some great points. And so in summary of that, like, what is the best advice you've received on or off the tennis court? So some wisdom, if you could please share. You shared lots, but
Yeah, and I, by the way, I should say in the private chat here, we have 2 questions from Leslie Dean here, but we'll get to them in just a sec here. But wow, I've been given so much advice, and I find most of the advice that I have actually comes from the athletic world. But what I would say is, and this is, by the way, I hope this is everyone hears this, but I've learned more through failure than through success. And believe me, you learn a lot about failure in amateur sport. And I think if, I was a, Novak Djokovic or Serena Williams, I wasn't of that caliber at all. But I would say that I learned a lot about myself through, and in tennis, you have to earn every single point. You have to earn it right till the end, and you can lose it. If you can have a mental flip and just, not necessarily, things might not necessarily go the way you had hoped. And I've learned to not get comfortable with failure, but to learn from it. And I think that's a really important thing to learn as you head into your own careers, is that it's not easy. And it certainly wasn't easy for me to not only become more confident in myself, become more adept at socializing, speaking, but I had to learn what it felt like to not have that. I've learned what it's like to be left behind as a student. I've learned what it's like to have something that's so certain. Oh yes, I'm going to win this match, and have it taken away. So never assume something's going to happen. You're going to have to fight hard for it, but you have to learn through failure. And when you have a disability, you learn that quite quickly, that it's not necessarily ourselves that we fail, but it's the environment in a lot of ways, and you have to navigate around that. So I do believe that that's one of the reasons why people with disabilities are terrific candidates for corporate roles and any path you want to take in a creative field as well, is that we've learned, we know how to adapt. And it's why we should have more positions in leadership roles as well.
Absolutely. Those are some really great points. Learning through failure. I like that. And so I think we've addressed some of the questions that were coming through, but one that we didn't quite kind of capture is if you could share any advice on supporting someone close to you that is newly disabled. So you mentioned the Paralympians who weren't initially able-bodied to disabled. So how to support someone who potentially become newly disabled that's in your life?
I've met athletes who were on the tennis court literally a few months after having a catastrophic injury. And one thing that's really important, and this goes for someone who has a child with a disability, you got to let them figure it out. You got to let them do things on their own, because that's going to set them up for success. I've actually, spoken at length to parents who, what'll happen and is they'll wheel their child, who's perfectly capable of wheeling their own chair. And in some cases, that's not the case for everyone. And really, again, I'm being very broad here, but in whatever way that the person with the disability can do it on their own, and we're talking an activity, tying their shoes, transferring, get them to do it, because that's going to set them up for success. So don't coddle. I know that's tough. Lead with empathy, but don't coddle. I've seen so many children who I grew up with that had a disability that didn't keep up, in doing things on their own And it translates into really being left behind in when it comes to eventually leaving the home. Now we have other concerns, including housing affordability and the economic. But when it comes to disability, there's nothing that empowers someone with a disability more than having them do things on their own. So really encourage them. It's okay to help when needed and ask, but eventually you start, putting up some of those stopgaps. But definitely offer help and be very, very, very patient, because the rehabilitation process for some can take months, others can take years. It can be very nuanced, but show concern, curiosity, and don't treat them any differently than the person that you knew pre-rehab, pre-accident.
Those are great points, and I like that idea of allowing that autonomy and not coddling. Huge points. Those are fantastic. And so we're going to close off with our last question before we open into Q&A. Sneeze? Nope. If you could leave each student with one final nugget of advice, which you've given, I still like learning through failure, but if there's anything else that you're settling in or percolating on, what would that be?
I would say start working on your own story. I think sometimes we often focus and we think, and I'm putting it more towards your careers here. We often think about, okay, well, I did this, I did that in this project, I worked here, but who are you? Because sometimes employers look at your own personal skills, your own personal story. And moving from sport to the corporate world, a lot of that was already done with me. I was like, well, this is what I learned. I learned how to budget, and I had to, because I wasn't getting sponsorship this year, so I had to learn how to pivot. I had to do blah blah. They want to get to know you and the person you are, and some of the obstacles you've personally overcome. So start kind of coming up with your own little story of what you've accomplished. What your hobbies are and how they translate into what corporations and organizations and creative outlets are looking for. Don't discount the things that might not seem like they're important. If you can turn it into a story, I think that's great. But also just a communication tactic here. If you're writing something, read it out loud before you submit it. That's just honestly like read it out loud. I know that's going into communications, and that's where I am now at RBC. I'm in corporate communications, but I can't tell you the number of times I'll ask someone who's maybe a co-op student or someone new to our team. Well, before you sent this, did you happen to read it out loud? Because again, read for who you're writing for, whether it's on your resume or anything that you're doing. If it's a group activity at Sheridan, just read it out loud. Like if it doesn't make sense when you hear it out loud, it won't make sense in when it's written. So that's all. Just a minor nitpick that has nothing to do with tennis.
Still incredibly useful, and I think useful career group projects, as you said, career resume, all of that. That's awesome. All right, so that pretty much wraps up our element of questions. I'm just checking the chat to see if we've had. So this is a nice question. So one final question. I thought that was it, but this is another good one. How can we drive change and inspire lasting connections?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. Sorry, the congestion's coming in. How can we drive change and inspire lasting connections?
Change and lasting connections. I think those are two things. I mean, change comes by being curious, by being inquisitive, by, not just going, oh, okay, but by asking follow-up questions. Like if I tell you, yeah, by the way, I struggled getting to work today. Elevator was down. Well, what is that? How does that make you feel when the elevator goes? It's frustrating because I wanted to get to work on time. Well, what if, the more you ask questions of someone, the more you're going to uncover. You might be a little annoying, and I'm known to be a little annoying sometimes. So, but don't worry about that. I think it's always good to be curious. But by making lasting connections, I think the way you make connections is there's a number of ways, but I think humor can go a long way. Not everyone is, as humorous as maybe someone else, but in my case, I've learned that humor can be a really good way to, and I'm not talking about self-deprecation here, but it's a good connection. Everyone can relate to being humorous, and it's a very human-centric feeling. but don't lead with those emotions. I would say don't be afraid to be authentic. Don't be afraid to show and acknowledge times where you're feeling down. I feel like if you get really personal with someone, they'll go, oh yeah, that's I'm feeling, I remember a colleague, I was asking them, I was like, man, why am I feeling so, what's that term? I forget that term. It's where you feel like you're not adequate for a role. Imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome. And I'm like, oh man, I have a whole case of imposter syndrome this week. Oh, I feel like that way all the time. Like, man, that connects you with someone so well sometimes when you say those things. And then, injecting a little humor in there. I don't know. I find that's a way, but also being very personable and empathetic and being warm. I always think those are good ways too.
Those are great points. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. So I think Sherry's going to come on now.
There we are. Well, thank you so much, Joel, for sharing everything you did with us today. It really was great hearing everything you had to share, your experience and your journey, and all the tips you had for everyone today. And thank you everyone else as well for all your great questions. I'm sure we've all been feeling inspired on how we can face some of our own challenges in the future. So thank you, Joel, and thank you, Deandra.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. So we're about to head into another break, and Delvine has a few more reminders for us.
Perfect. Thank you, Sherry.